The Old West was a well-known time of lawlessness, so it's no surprise that there were many active serial killers stalking the prairies and deserts of North America. Whether they murdered for profit, pleasure, or both, the impact was extreme. The photos and ruthlessness of the following crimes may shock you, so mentally prepare yourself for the brutality we are going to show you now. You don't want to run into a serial killer, but what if I tell you there was a family who all killed back in the Old West? In this photo, you'll see the Bloody Benders, Kansas's killer innkeepers. In late 1870, the seemingly innocuous Bender family settled in Osage Township, Kansas, only to become one of the Wild West's most notorious serial killers. Luring weary travelers with the promise of a safe haven, this family of four turned their cozy inn into a slaughterhouse, brutally murdering up to 21 unsuspecting victims. In an era where the West was fraught with danger, a refuge was a precious find. The Benders played the part of a loving family, offering food, rest, and warmth. But once their guests' backs were turned, the Benders would bash in their skulls, steal their money, and bury them in the backyard. Survivors of the Benders' murderous scheme recounted chilling encounters. They spoke of a peculiar setup, a sheet hung in a room with the men hiding behind it, and the women urging guests to sit in a specific chair. Those who refused saw mob Benders rage, followed by the men emerging menacingly from behind the sheet. These wary travelers likely escaped death by mere seconds. Despite their heinous crimes, the Benders vanished without a trace, evading capture and leaving their gruesome legacy shrouded in mystery. Kill a family with an axe or hunting jackrabbits? I see no difference. Meet Stephen D. Richards, the Nebraska fiend of the Old West. This is the only real photo that exists of this killer, and as you can see, he did not escape justice. Dubbed the Nebraska Fiend, Stephen D. Richards was the Old West answer to Ted Bundy. A charming and articulate man, Richards left a trail of terror in his wake. Unlike Bundy, showing no preference for his victims, he murdered indiscriminately, from a young man he quarreled with to a mother and her 3 children, whom he brutally slaughtered with an axe. Chillingly, he compared killing the family to hunting jackrabbits. In total, Richards claimed 9 lives. Unlike some notorious outlaws of his time, he did not escape justice. The Nebraska Fiend met his end on the gallows in 1879, bringing a grim chapter of the Old West to a close. Want to meet the Jeffrey Dahmer of the Old West? Want a piece of me? Levi Boone Helm, the Kentucky cannibal of the Wild West, took this a bit too seriously. Levi Boone Helm, a notorious mountain man and gunslinger, earned his gruesome nickname as the Kentucky Cannibal. Helm and his gang terrorized Oregon and Idaho with their ruthless stealing and murdering sprees. By the time Helm joined the gang, he had already left a bloody trail of bodies in his wake. One harrowing episode cemented his infamy. Caught in a deadly snowstorm, Helm and his companion, Burton, discovered an empty cabin with no food. When Burton took his own life, Helm made the chilling decision to cannibalize his body to survive. Emerging from the storm, Helm returned to his life of crime. But his reign of terror was not endless. He and his gang were eventually captured and brought to trial. Despite his efforts to defend himself, Helm was convicted and hanged, leaving behind a legacy as one of the Wild West's most macabre figures. He left a mark with these photos of his victims. But until today, this serial killer has not been identified. We talk about the Servant Girl Annihilator. He was a serial killer who murdered 7 women and 1 man in Austin, Texas in 1884 and 1885. He also maimed 6 other women and 2 men. The murders were thought to have been partially motivated by racism because many of the victims were black. The murderer would typically attack his victims while they were asleep before dragging the bodies outside. The police were given conflicting reports on what the killer looked like, with differing accounts as to whether he was white or black. As many as 400 men were arrested in connection to the crimes, but none were convicted. Let the record show I've killed 51 men, let her rip. The words of James Miller, infamously known as Miller the Killer, led a double life as a cold-blooded murderer for hire while maintaining the guise of a devout churchgoer. Nicknamed Deacon Miller for his regular church attendance and apparent lack of vices, he didn't smoke or drink, fooling his community with his pious public persona. However, beneath this facade lurked a ruthless killer. Miller's dark side first emerged when he orchestrated the murder of his sister's fiancé, a man he loathed. Although arrested and convicted, Miller escaped justice when the charges were overturned on a technicality. He then turned his lethal proclivities into a lucrative career, accepting large sums of money to carry out executions. His seemingly virtuous outward appearance shielded his sinister activities from his unsuspecting community, even allowing him a brief stint as a lawman. However, his downfall came when he assassinated a former deputy U.S. Marshal, inciting the wrath of the public. An enraged mob captured Miller, and as they prepared to hang him, he defiantly shouted, "Let her rip!" James Miller's chilling duality and ultimate demise cemented his legacy as one of the most duplicitous and dangerous figures of the Wild West. John Wesley Hardin was the last man you'd think would become a vicious outlaw. Being born to and raised by a preacher didn't stop John from getting into trouble at an early age. His first kill was at the age of 15, and he would not stop after just one man. It's possible he killed up to 42 men. His temper was well known, and it was common for him to murder anyone who bothered him. John didn't just kill troublesome people, of course. In his time, it was common to kill people and then rob them. John was eventually imprisoned for his crimes, a rarity for someone on this list. But he didn't evade vigilante justice altogether. After spending 17 years in prison, John lived in El Paso, Texas. As you can imagine, with that temper and all, he was not well liked. One day, John got into a heated argument with a lawman named John Selman. Not long afterward, Selman walked up behind John and shot him in the head. Bill Longley, the ruthless psychopath of the Old West. Bill Longley was a cold-blooded psychopath, leaving a trail of death in his wake by the time he turned 20. Known for his volatile temper and avowed racism, Longley frequently targeted black people and Mexicans. His reign of terror included an incident where he and his friends encountered 3 black men, Green Evans, Pryor Evans, and Ned, who were freed slaves traveling to visit friends. Longley and his gang held the men at gunpoint. In their panic to escape, Green Evans was shot and killed. Longley's final act of murder was the killing of his childhood friend, Wilson Anderson. Already a wanted man, this murder placed additional bounties on his head and mobilized vigilante groups to hunt him down. Eventually captured and convicted, Longley faced execution by hanging. His death was far from quick and painless. The initial loose noose caused his knees to hit the ground. When the rope was finally tightened, Longley endured a slow, agonizing suffocation, taking 11 minutes before he died. Bill Longley's life and death underscore the brutality and lawlessness of the Old West, leaving behind a legacy of violence and racial hatred. They killed his wife, he ate their liver. John Jeremiah Garrison Johnston, famously known as Liver-Eating Johnson, was a mountain man whose life is shrouded in legend. The most infamous tale involves how he earned his gruesome nickname. According to the stories, after his wife was killed by a Crow Native American, Johnston embarked on a vendetta against the entire tribe. It's said that he killed over 300 Crow warriors, scalped them, and ate their livers, a grave insult to the Crow, who believed the liver was essential for the afterlife. However, the truth is likely less macabre. Johnston probably never consumed anyone's liver. The rumor most likely began as a dark joke he shared that spiraled out of control. Despite the bloody legend, Johnston is said to have eventually made peace with the Crow tribe. In reality, the Crow were known to be friendly with American frontiersmen, adding to the difficulty of distinguishing fact from fiction in Johnston's story. John Jeremiah Garrison Johnston died in 1900, penniless and without any family to speak of, leaving behind a legacy that blends myth and reality in the annals of the Old West. Delphine LaLaurie, a wealthy New Orleans socialite, went down in history for her horrific treatment of slaves. Her atrocities were exposed in 1834 when an elderly slave set fire to LaLaurie's home in a desperate suicide attempt to escape her brutal punishments. When authorities responded to the fire, they discovered a grisly scene in the attic, where several slaves were found in various states of torture. She attempted to turn a woman into a human caterpillar. She wrapped her slaves' intestines around their bodies like belts. She stuffed animal waste into one woman's mouth, then sewed it shut. And this is just the beginning. LaLaurie's cruelty had a long history. She had previously whipped a young girl off the roof, prompting police to force her to sell her slaves. However, she circumvented this by having her relatives purchase the slaves and secretly return them to her house. In an unprecedented act of compassion for the era, Lalauríe's neighbors formed a mob, outraged by her inhumane actions. They drove her and her family from their home, ensuring that her reign of terror would end. Delphine Lalauríe's legacy is a stark reminder of the cruelty that can lurk behind a facade of wealth and respectability, making her one of the most infamous figures in the history of New Orleans. Ever heard of the Wild West's most notorious gunslinger? Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty in 1859, is a name that strikes fear and fascination into the hearts of many. By the age of 18, he had already carved out a reputation as one of the most infamous gunslingers of the American frontier. Legend has it he killed 21 men, one for each year of his short life. But who was Billy the Kid, really? A cold-blooded killer, or a misunderstood young man caught up in the violence of his times? Our story begins in the rough-and-tumble streets of New York City, where young Henry McCarty was born. Orphaned at a young age, he moved west with his family, seeking a new life. But the Wild West was a lawless place, and it wasn't long before Henry found himself on the wrong side of the law. By his early teens, he had already been arrested for petty theft. But it was in the New Mexico territory where Henry McCarty truly became Billy the Kid. Caught up in the bloody Lincoln County War, a violent feud between rival factions vying for control of the cattle industry, Billy quickly proved himself a skilled and deadly gunman. His quick draw and fearless demeanor earned him both allies and enemies. Billy's most infamous act came in 1880, when he escaped from the Lincoln County Courthouse, killing 2 deputies in the process. This daring escape only added to his legend. Despite numerous manhunts and a hefty bounty on his head, Billy managed to evade capture time and again, becoming a symbol of rebellion and resistance against the corrupt authorities of the time. But who was the real Billy the Kid? Some say he was a ruthless killer, responsible for the deaths of 21 men. Others argue he was a folk hero, standing up for justice in a lawless land. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Billy was undoubtedly a product of his environment, a young man trying to survive in a world where violence was often the only answer. In July 1881, Billy's luck finally ran out. He was tracked down and shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett in a darkened room at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. He was just 21 years old, but his legend lived on, immortalized in countless books, movies, and songs. Get ready for a wild ride through the heart of the Old West. Meet the Doolin-Dalton Gang, also known as the Oklahombras and the Wild Bunch. Founded by the notorious William Bill Doolin in 1893, after the Dalton Gang's disastrous Coffeyville raid, this crew quickly became legends of lawlessness. Operating out of Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, the gang boasted a lineup of infamous outlaws like George Bitter Creek Newcomb, Charlie Pierce, Oliver Ole Yantis, William Marion Bill Dalton, William Tulsa Jack Blake, Dan Dynamite Dick Clifton, Roy Dougherty, K.A. Arkansas Tom Jones, George Redbuck Waitman, Richard Little Dick West, and William F. Lem Little Bill Raidler. For 3 thrilling years, they terrorized Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas with daring bank, stagecoach, and train robberies. Despite their ruthless crimes, Bill Doolin's charisma earned them a Robin Hood image, winning the support of locals who helped them evade the law and even stood by them in their legendary battle with U.S. Marshals in Ingalls, Oklahoma. On September 1st, 1893, the infamous Ingalls gunfight erupted. Holed up in George Ransom's saloon, the gang faced off against the law in a bloody shootout that left 9 dead or wounded, including a deputy who died on the spot and 2 others who succumbed to their injuries the next day. The gang didn't escape unscathed. 3 outlaws were wounded, and Arkansas Tom Jones was captured. The Doolin-Dalton Gang's reign of terror continued until January 1896, when Bill Doolin was captured while relaxing in a Eureka Springs, Arkansas bathhouse by the legendary Deputy U.S. Marshal Bill Tillman. But Doolin's story didn't end there. He broke out of the Guthrie, Oklahoma jail alongside Dynamite Dick Clifton and others, evading capture for months. The saga concluded on August 25, 1896, near Lawson, Oklahoma territory. When Heck Thomas and his posse cornered Doolin, he chose to fight. After firing twice, he was taken down in a hail of bullets from Deputy Bill Dunn and Thomas, marking the end of the Wild Bunch's notorious exploits.